Welcome to our graduate school information session. We put it on about this time every year, and this is the first time we've done it virtually, so I'm sure there will be a few bumps along the road, but we'll do the best we can. If the students who are in attendance would sign a sign-in sheet, I'm going to go ahead and post a link in the chat a little while from now, just so we know who attended and so I can contact you in the future with materials, probably later this week, if you're interested in that. So I'll post that in a moment. But just so we could kind of get a few other things on people's radar, I am recording this session, so it will be accessible later. I say that for a couple reasons. One is so that, obviously we are going to have this video available to people who are unable to make it tonight. And I heard from several people who had conflicts or in a completely different time zone. It made it really hard to attend. But the other reason is just so you know whether you want to have your video on or off. So then you can make an informed decision about that. When we get to Q&A, I hope that you will turn your video on just to ask your question and receive that response. Of course, that's up to you. And I'll also be monitoring the chat so that those of you who'd rather ask questions through chat, I can kind of play a mediating role and relay those questions to our panelists as the night goes on. As you are aware, we start off with a faculty panel, and that's going to be the first hour of tonight, and then we're going to move in to talking to graduate students in our department. Our faculty panelists, we're so grateful to have them with us tonight. So Dr. Beth Marsh is with us, Dr. Tim Strauman, Dr. Tina Williams, and Dr. Makiba Wilborn. And they all represent different training areas, graduate training areas here at Duke. And those training areas map onto lots of other programs that you might be considering applying to. So they are, going to be able to tell you things that are specific to those areas, as well as giving general advice. So if we could, panelists, thank you for being here first of all, really appreciate it. And if we could start off by having you each introduce yourselves and talk about anything that is specific to your training area before we then transition to kind of more of a general advice for people who are considering applying. That would be really great. The question is, who wants to go first? Dr. Wilborn?
Not ever used to being picked first, so I was like, oh, it's not going to be me. I'm a developmental psychologist, and I got my PhD at Cornell in the Department of Human Development. So Cornell is unique in some schools. They have developmental psychology only in the psych department. And then some schools only have developmental psychology in like a human development or applied development or a development in education. And so Cornell's unique in that they had a psych department that had some developmental faculty, but your degree was not actually considered developmental psychology. And then you could only get your developmental psychology PhD from the Department of Human Development. I think Yuri Bromfenbitter sort of made that happen back a long time ago. So if you are interested in developmental psychology, there's lots of different routes you can go. And it's really about what you're specifically interested in studying, but also importantly, who you're interested in studying with. So one of the leading scholars in early word learning is in the School of Education and also in psychology, but in the University of Delaware. So it's really focused on the research and who you're interested in and what you want to do. So some developmental programs are much more research and sort of teaching based in their training, and some are more applied. So my program at Cornell had two tracks. They had the sort of research teaching track for students, and then they had what's called a research applied track. So those people, my cohort, they actually went on to work at like Capitol Hill, or they did research to work in like youth development centers. And so it's really about what you want to do in terms of how your research is applied. Some have gone on to be evaluators for assessment and school programs. So there's lots of different ways you can get a developmental psychology degree. Developmental psychology is not just studying kids, contrary to what a lot of people believe. It's studying change over time. And so that can go all the way through, they do call it gerontology, but human development, lifespan development, it has lots of different ways to sort of think about it. But there's also development that can be sort of housed in another discipline. So a cognitive developmental neuroscientist, right? There's a social psychologist who is a social development psychologist. So there's lots of really cool ways to mix and match, and lots of different departments and areas that you can get a degree. It's really focused on what you're excited about and who's doing the work that you're interested in doing work with, and then where they're housed. So I hope that kind of confuses you, but also helps you understand that there's lots of different ways. There's lots of different paths to get to getting a developmental psychology PhD.
Thank you. Dr. Williams?
Sure, I'm a neuroscientist or a behavioral neuroscientist, but I can also sort of represent cognitive neuroscience as well. Perhaps some of you are interested in sort of human neuroscience. And I mean, I'm going to probably just take off where Makiba left off, which is essentially there are lots of ways to do graduate work in neuroscience or cognitive neuroscience. I would say that that it's important, and I'm sure Makiba would agree with me on this, as would everyone else on the panel, that it's important for when you think about graduate school to think about who you want to work with, not just where you want to go to school. It's not like applying to an undergraduate school where you want to go to a prestigious school. And that's really what you're looking at. You're looking at the Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Stanfords, Penns, Dukes of the world, right? For graduate school, if you're interested in a particular area or thing or topic or technique or question, what you want to do is find people, find researchers who are working in that area, because graduate school is essentially an apprenticeship program. And what you do is you get started, you work in a lab, you learn from the laboratory. There may be a couple of faculty members whose work you're particularly interested in, but ultimately you're going to have a mentor who's going to be your PhD advisor. And it's critically important when you think about graduate school to look at the faculty and to figure out, is there anyone on in this department, in this area, that you'd actually like to do research with, because you're really interested in the topic that they're working on, because that's what you're going to be doing, and that's who is going to admit you to graduate school. So that said, there are lots of ways in neuroscience and cognitive neuroscience at many schools to work with an individual faculty. So you heard Dr. Wilburn talk about the fact that faculty might be in a particular program, but also have an appointment in a particular department. And so when that happens, you could apply to a graduate program that's in the program, but you could also apply to the department's graduate program. And so here at Duke, for instance, we have something called a cognitive neuroscience admitting program. And in that program, you apply to the program. There are lots of faculty across many different departments who are part of this admitting program. And when you get here, you have to make a decision about who you're going to work with, but also what departments you're going to get your PhD from. And it's great to start out by thinking, yes, I'd really like to work with Professor X or Professor Y, or maybe I don't know exactly who I want to work with, but it's one of these two faculty members or one of these three faculty members. And when you come here for an interview, then those are the people who you're going to be appealing to. But those faculty members are also part of a department. So many of the faculty members in CogNeuro are also part of the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience. And they also have a cognitive neuroscience PhD program. And so if you already know who you want to work with, that's also a way to work with that individual faculty member. So that's just a bit of advice, is to recognize that many faculty are affiliated with multiple programs to get your PhD in, all right? And I think that it's important also for you to understand that admitting programs like the one at Duke, but other programs across the country Our admitting program doesn't give a PhD. You start in the program and then you affiliate with a department that gives a PhD. But in many other schools, these admitting programs also give a PhD. So there are PhDs in cognitive neuroscience at various schools. And one of the differences between a department-based program and one of these large admitting programs is that you get admitted not necessarily with a commitment to work in a particular lab. And so you have to spend your first year or two rotating from lab to lab to try to find a match. It's kind of like dating. You have to find someone who wants you in their lab, and you have to find someone whose lab you'd like to work in. So it's a bit, it's nice because you get to sample things, but also it's not a sure thing, meaning you may come in wanting to work with someone, but ending up working with someone else because that person isn't that interested in working with you in their lab. So it's a bit more of a risk. Department programs tend to admit you to work in a particular lab. So if you already know who you might want to work with, departmental-based programs are often a better way and a more assured way of working with the person who you actually want to work with. So those are kind of some tips about programs. I should also add that if you're really interested in neuroscience, not just cognitive neuroscience, many programs are actually, they come out of medical centers, not out of arts and sciences kind of programs. Many of them are actually in medical centers. So your degree is from a medical center, not from a liberal arts department like psychology and neuroscience. So you have to look very broadly if you're interested in neuroscience, because the programs come, there are large admitting programs, there are department-based programs, there are programs in liberal arts universities like Duke, there are programs in medical centers like Duke. Duke has a neurobiology program. And so there are lots and lots of different ways and different kinds of programs, and you have to be sure that it fits your interests and the way in which you kind of want to navigate your graduate career.
Thanks, Dr. Williams. So now we get to see who wants to fight over the next spot. Dr. Marsh, do you want to go? Should we?
I'm happy to go, thank you. So I am a cognitive psychologist, and I'm in the cognition and cognitive neuroscience area here at Duke. So just to follow up on what Dr. Williams was just saying, my area here is a mix of both people who are more behavioral like me and cognitive neuroscientists who are using predominantly neuroimaging tools. So one thing to pay attention to is sometimes CogPsych is separate, and sometimes it's intermixed with CogNeuro, and sometimes you have departments of cognitive science, which are more likely to be a mix of psychology, philosophy, computer science, linguistics. And so, you know, I would encourage you, again, like both of my colleagues have already said, to pay the most attention both to individuals who you want to work with, although I do still think there's a certain boost from the prestige of the university. If you can have both, that's ideal. But I was going to say that, for example, I have people who apply to work with me who lean social, who lean developmental, and I feel like what they're really looking for is the match in research interests, so rather than exactly the label of the program. So look at people and see if they all line up in the same program, but they may not. And so sometimes, depending on your interest, you may find yourself applying to cognitive at one school and developmental another school because you're really interested in, you know, children's memory. And just depending on which school you're looking at, that may be in cognitive or in developmental. And so I just want to emphasize that the area boundaries, I think, are less important than paying attention with who you might want to work with.
Thanks. Now, Dr. Straumann, I believe you have some slides. It's part of why I thought you might go last.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Tim Straumann. I'm a clinical psychologist. So I happen to have a license. I am one of those people who does a lot of different things. I'm an academic. I do research. I teach. I don't do a lot of therapy at the moment, but I have a therapy research program. So I want to say a couple things and then turn to a couple of slides. The first thing I want to say is everything that you just heard applies to getting a PhD in clinical psychology. Okay, a PhD in clinical psychology is a PhD in psychology, first and foremost. And in addition to that, it also involves training in the application of psychological science. Many people who go into it don't really take the PhD side as seriously as they need to. And if you want to go that route, and we'll come back to that in a second, if you want to go that route, you're getting a PhD in psychology, and you're going to be expected to do the things that you'd be expected to do in developmental or in cognitive neuroscience or in cognitive. It's a PhD. And that's something that you need to be ready for. And I want to encourage you to take it seriously if this is what you think your career path is. So with that, I'm going to share my screen. Where did it go? There's where it went. All right. I got 2 slides. Okay, and this is a bit of a transition, but it's going to move us on to the sort of discussion about advice. Most people who I talk to who say they want to be clinical psychologists are really saying they want to be therapists. Sometimes they mean I want a PhD in psychology, you know, which is what I did and what I wanted. But a lot of times people just say I want to be a therapist. So what are your options? There are many options. In psychology, for example, there are 3. You can get a clinical psychology degree, either a PhD or a PsyD, a counseling psychology degree, a school psychology degree. There are a number of other highly respected professions that can lead you to the same kind of work, that each have their own particular niche, their own particular set of expertise. And I just listed a few of them here: social work, marriage and family therapy, psychiatric nursing, psychiatry as a subspecialty of medicine. So the first take-home message I want to impress on folks who are thinking about therapy and clinical psychology is figure out what you want. Don't think about prestige. Don't think about income. Think about what it is you want to do professionally. Do you want to be a full-time therapist? That's great. Do you want to also be a researcher? Do you like teaching? Do you like mentoring? Do you want to work in policy? Do you want to work in administration? Do you want to develop interventions? Think about what it is you want to do, and don't allow yourself to be limited by considerations of, well, I think, you know, having a PhD is more prestigious than having an MSW. That's not going to make you happy. All right. Second slide. Why is it not advancing? Okay. Clinical psychology programs are really competitive. They're crazy competitive. But the trick is they're competitive because lots of people are applying to them and are not really ready to apply to them. So the numbers can be deceiving. This is a long-term process. Most people do not get in the first time. I didn't get in the first time or the second time or the third time. It took me 4 times. And then I only got into 1 program. How do you make yourself qualified? This is going to turn us to sort of more general things. It's nice to have strong grades. It's nice to have good GRE scores, although the future of the GRE is sort of uncertain now. Strong and thoughtful letters of recommendation. And I know my colleagues will have lots of things to say about that. Research experience, applied experience, a master's degree. Nobody has all of these things, but the people who are successful have many of them. What you really need, and I want to emphasize this, not just as clinical, but across the board, have a clearly articulated set of goals. That this is what I want to do. This is what I want to study. This is what I want to learn. And make sure the places you're applying are a match for that set of goals. So I'm really reiterating what Dr. Marsh and Dr. Williams and Dr. Wilborn already said. If this is what you want to do with your life, be ready to dedicate your life to it. And that's true whether you're going into any specialty in psychology or anything else that's even in this domain. So I say go for it. And why don't we maybe, Angie, we can turn to some questions now.
Sounds great. So what questions do the attendees have for our panelists around any of the things that they've already alluded to, or other things? Making yourself a strong candidate, or getting involved with faculty.
Can I
Yes.
just want to add one quick thing. Gap years. So I want to highlight that I know for a fact that some of our colleagues in clinical, I've had great candidates who like applied to me, and they actually were a better fit for clinical. And since they didn't have any gap years, some of my colleagues were like, no, they're not ready. Gap years are actually in developmental, I can speak to, and what knowledge I have of clinical, gap years are actually seen as really positive, that you've had some time to like percolate, like let the sweet potatoes sit and get all the goods in it. So you're going into it well sort of seasoned, knowing who you are, because it's like you're like a blue chip athlete. They pay for you to go, most programs, depending on if you do a master's, maybe not. So they're really sort of banking on this relationship over a 5-year period, and everyone changes. So people are like, I just always wanted to go to grad school. And we can tell usually in those statements, those students who are like, well, I said my freshman year I was going to go to grad school in psych, and now I'm doing it, because there's not a lot of depth to that thinking. So go explore. Well, it's COVID, so maybe not, but like, go be a barista or go do something that allows you to really kind of know who you are, and also get away from Duke and get some perspective, and then decide if that's possible. So I'm not saying that's what everyone has to do, but it is in some parts of psychology really viewed fondly, that like this student has taken the time, they really kind of have grounded themselves, and they're pursuing what they really want, not what they were expected to pursue. So I want to get that in.
Thanks.
Can I just follow up on that and say how much I agree with that? Although I would argue that we get particularly excited when people's gap year is spent working in a lab. It really shows that people care deeply about the problem, that they know what they're getting into. It makes you more competitive for fellowships. Maybe then you'll get a publication or a presentation. It's like, I think, you know, when I look over our graduate students, the vast majority of them have had some kind of gap year, and many of them have worked in a lab. And so I just wanted to stress that that is like one of the best things that you could do to make yourself more qualified.
I have a question. My name is Molly. I'm a senior, and I'm currently applying to cognitive science programs, some of which are like housed in psych departments, others are their own. But I was wondering, so like a lot of schools ask in your statement of purpose to include a few faculty who you would be interested in working with. Do you think it's important or necessary to have made contact with all of the people that you list in your essay, or at least one or two? Yeah.
Dr. Williams? You're muted. Still muted.
About that?
Great.
About that? My dog was barking, so I muted myself. Yes, so yeah, no, I was going to say that absolutely you should try to contact people, particularly this year. You say you're in the process of applying, but I must admit that this is a particularly difficult year for most schools. There's a lot of budget limitations, and it's important to know whether faculty are even accepting students. And so don't waste your $90 or $100 on an application to a school where the faculty member who you want to work with is not accepting any students this year, because graduate programs in sort of cognitive science or developmental are pretty small at every school. And it's really important, if a faculty member's taken a student last year, they probably won't be taking a student this year. If they took 2 students the year before, they might not be taking another student this year. So it's not that every faculty member takes a student every single year. So I think it's really important. And I have to say that there are sort of 2 issues here. One is, yes, you should try to contact them, and keep your email short, but very informative. I am a senior at Duke University. I am majoring in, and I am interested in the area that you're working on, with some minimal description of what that area is. I'm excited about potentially applying to your program in X to maybe work with you. I wondered if you were accepting students. Um, that's a plenty long email. Faculty don't particularly, and be sure that you use your Duke email address. Absolutely don't use a Gmail address. And be sure to have a subject header that makes some sense, like interested in applying to your graduate program, or you know, or something about the graduate program would be useful.
So like, does it look bad if I reach out to like 5 different professors in the same department? Like, is what I was asking, if I have to list like 3 or 4 of them, like will they talk to each other, and will it like look bad if I say that I'm interested in multiple of them?
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Beth.
I was going to say, I think it's great if you really have overlapping interests with 5 people. Like, we want people that can work with lots of different people. However, if you're just listing people to list people, that's not very helpful. And yes, I would assume that people in a graduate training area will talk to each other. And if multiple people are excited about you, that would increase your chances of getting it. I was just going to follow up on Dr. Williams' helpful statement, though, and say, you know, sometimes depending on the nature of that initial contact, some people are willing to talk to people early on in the application process. You know, like I've already talked to 3 people this year based on the emails that they sent me because they wrote something interesting enough. Some people don't do that. You know, some people feel like it's not a good idea, but it is your first chance to make an impression with somebody. And it's also a chance for them to tell you if there's something they really need, like funding. They may be telling you that you need to apply to a certain thing at the same time that you're applying to graduate school for funding. So these are, I think Dr. Williams is right in that they can't be too long, but they're very important emails.
Right.
Thank you.
Please proofread them and make sure you don't put the wrong faculty's name. Please don't, because I've gotten that. I just forwarded it. I'm assuming the same for me.
Yeah.
I mean, I knew them. It was a colleague at a school, and so I was like, hey, here you go, sweetie. This one looks great. So make sure, and then have your mentors or have someone read it and give you, quick feedback on, is it too long? Is it too short? It's important to make sure, because if you don't take the time there, some people will automatically just say, like, if they can't get an email right, like, then they don't have the attention to detail, whatever it is. So it's not that you have to craft the perfect email. It's that it just can't have glaring, like, copy and paste, grammatical, or, issues. So that's important.
Any other advice around emails, contacts?
Well, I would suggest, I mean, again, I think what Dr. Marsh said and Dr. Wilmot said are really, really great suggestions. But I would also be a little careful emailing many, many faculty in a department. Unless the faculty really have overlapping interests, you're going to appear very vague in terms of your own interests if you contact somebody who's 5 people who are working on very, very different things. And then they do compare notes, and then they think, well, this person is just writing to everybody, and they don't really have a specific interest in me. And we faculty member really love it when someone writes to us and says that they're really interested in our research and they're really interested in working in our lab. That turns us on as faculty. And so limiting the number of people that you write to, or making sure that you're writing to people who have overlapping interests and who have collaborated together in a department are wonderful things, absolutely wonderful things to do.
Any other questions from attendees right now?
I have one for Dr. Stroman. Dr. Stroman, what are some competitive sort of gap year activities that someone who's interested in clinical research or clinical psychology and research might do? Something that I try to do before I commit to something is like, try it out a little bit. So I've had like a little bit of counseling training, a little bit of crisis response training. And I know that there are like crisis lines that exist for people, but how well does that generalize? Is that at all competitive? How do schools feel about that? Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, those are great questions. I can tell you what my general philosophy is. If I have two applicants and one is right out of an undergraduate program and the other has taken a year or two, gotten some life experience, not necessarily in a lab that does what I do, certainly as a tiebreaker, I'm going to take the person who's been on the planet a little bit longer, has had a little bit more time to think about what they want to do. I'm actually not convinced that the specific content of what people do in a gap year is as critical as how does it help you develop to become a member of the scientific community. There are a lot of ways to do that. My gap year activities, gap times 4 year activities, was I worked for a drug company on cancer research, which I knew absolutely nothing about. And it turned out to be a wonderful experience. I learned a ton. It convinced me that I loved research. I look back on it now, and at the time I didn't appreciate just how much of a difference it was going to make. There are so many different things that the ideal everybody shoots for is I'm going to work in a lab that's doing exactly the kind of work that I want. There aren't many of those, right? If you can get one, that's great. But there are opportunities with nonprofits. Anybody who knows how to handle data, nonprofits are crying for people who want to take their data and make sense of it and help them do better policy, do better intervention. Medical centers operate on large grants, and when you get it, you're an investigator and you get a grant, you find out you got a grant today, you got to hire somebody tomorrow. The clock is ticking. Most of those grants hire people who have bachelor's level training, and it could be in a whole variety of different things that on the surface have nothing to do with psychology or neuroscience. It's still great experience. It's a holistic endeavor. You're trying to grow yourself to become a member of a scientific community and to be able to show programs when you do apply that you're mature, that you're serious, that you're hardworking. And in addition to that, you also have a sense of what work you want to do and who you want to work with.
I was going to add that one kind of thing that I think people don't realize is that the National Institutes of Health has sort of a gap year sort of program for students coming out of psychology and neuroscience type programs. I mean, many of the labs there take just newly graduated students and have them as research assistants for a year or two. I think it's called the IRTA. Is it IR? Is it IR?
IRTA, yeah.
IRTA program. You might look it up. It's a wonderful opportunity. There are lots of people doing work on, schizophrenia and depression and Alzheimer's disease and, you name it, drug addiction, and might be something that you'd be interested in. And that's a wonderful program because it encourages the fellows in that program to get together. They have lots of opportunities to hear talks. You get exposed to a lot of different labs and a lot of different kinds of research opportunities. So it's a great program, and lots of Duke students have done that.
Thank you, doctors.
I want to also highlight, it can be really nerve-wracking to feel like this is something that everyone's doing or you have to do. So what I want to highlight is I didn't even know what research was when I was an undergrad. I just wanted to have a good time. I graduated, I partied with my friends, and I got a job, and I want to make my car look cool. So, and I'm on your panel. Woohoo! How about that? So the reality is, it's how you weave together. So some of you might not have a damn clue as to what you're doing. I'd rather have you figure that out than rush to something you're not sure of. But in your statement, it's how you make sense of it. So a life experience, if you can work in a lab, great. But if you don't, that doesn't automatically mean that you're not going to be a candidate. It's your statement. So if you say, like Dr. Stroman said, like, how did this experience change me, affect me, help me get to this decision? What skills did I get? That to me is much more compelling than someone who just lists all these like cool things they did. But if you can talk about how being a barista taught you X, Y, and Z, and now you want to really help people because you noticed that you were like doing therapy and, you know, and whatever it is, as long as it makes sense that this is sort of now where you are, that's important. I'm a first genner, and what I will tell you that is, if I was like watching this and as a first gen undergrad, I would have been like, oh, I'm done. Like, I'm gonna work at the Gap, which is nothing wrong with it. You get great deals. But the point is, there's lots of different paths. And the most important part is the more you know who you are and what what you want, that's gonna come out really beautifully in your statement. And your letter writers are gonna be able to really provide that. So that packet is just gonna all make really nice sense. And that's what matters the most. If you can get these great experiences in great places, that's awesome. That's just going to make it better. But I don't want you to feel like you have to have that. What you have to have is some clarity and being kind of grounded in what matters to you. I hope that helps with someone's uncomfort.
Questions?
I had a question. So I recently, I'm Janina, I'm a junior majoring in psychology and minoring in education. I recently realized that I might be interested in getting a PhD. And I'm wondering if it's too late to like develop these relationships with like advisors and mentors. Cause like, I don't want it to be forced cause I'm I'm an honest person and I can't fake anything, but I know that it's like time to like make these relationships, and I don't know how to go about doing that. Yeah.
All right. So one way to think about this is all of us who are on the faculty were in your position. And we know now that, you know, what you're doing is exactly what we needed to do. And we needed to find places to start. This is our job. This is our vocation. This is what we do. We know students are going to come to us. We like when students come to us. It's why we do the jobs we do. It's why we're professors. Just as a way to start, think about people you've had for class already. Just say, who would I want to work with? Who would I want to apprentice under? Whose lab would I want to spend some time in? And that may or may not have anything to do with some specific research topic or question that you're ultimately going to go on to do. Maybe you really liked them. You liked how they thought. You liked what the class was. Sit down with them and talk with them and get some general advice and find out what their lab is doing. That is not an imposition. That's our job. That's how we run our labs. What could be better than a smart, motivated student comes knocking on my door and says, hey, I've read your work. I really like your work. You got any opportunities? What's bad about that? Think about it that way.
Thank you very much.
And start talking to people. You're a junior and maybe you're looking for an opportunity for spring. Don't wait till spring. Talk to people this term to figure something out for spring, and think about what skills you can learn more than the specific topic, because there may be, like Dr. Stroman said, not everyone will have an opening, but you talk to some people, you find a place you feel comfortable, and if you learn about data, if you learn about neuroscience, you learn these different things, you'll be able to sell those when you move on to the next step, even if it's not exactly the right topic.
Thank you very much.
I want to jump in for students of other, whatever that means, okay? What we know is that, and this was my case, is that I didn't have the socialization. I didn't even know you were supposed to ever talk to faculty. Like you didn't talk to them. You just sat in their class and you got a grade, right? So this can be really intimidating, especially if you come from a culture where you don't just approach an adult and say like, I want to do something with you. Like some of those culture, like some of you, I don't even see your faces. Some of you are like, oh my God, because that's like a cultural violation. So how do you merge that? Well, one thing is the classes, you can go to office hours, and with Zoom, it's weird, and ask a question about a topic in the class or some aspect, something that was taught in the class. And be excited, energetic about that concept. Then talk about like the research. So it doesn't have to be like this strategic, like I have to go and make this impression and have them like me, because that's a lot of pressure. So you can ease in that way. If there's a faculty member or a particular class that you really like and you engage, you can send emails or ask questions. So there's ways that you can sort of ease into a relationship and not feel like you have to like really prepare yourself like this interview and jump in. Because I know I've coached a lot of students in this, and it's really overwhelming. There's so much on the line. What if they don't like me? Okay. And in terms of getting a letter, one of the damaging things for students, especially underrepresented students, is that if they get a lukewarm or bad letter, and that's often interpreted like they're not as good. But what we do know is that students of color often have a hard time making connections to where someone knows them well enough to be able to write in depth. And so I encourage students who feel like they haven't established relationships, or if they're unsure, it's better, again, to wait, like keep trying to establish the relationships, maybe seek a gap year experience, because you want letters that actually can speak to you and who you are. Not, she got an A in my class, she showed up on time, she was really, she seemed motivated. Coming from Duke, that's actually going to hurt you. Here's why. Every applicant from Harvard, Yale, Penn, Duke, Vanderbilt, they all have that. They showed up good, they showed up on time, they were motivated. That's why you're at one of the top schools in the country. You need more than just they did the X grade in my class and they were motivated. And what you need is someone to be able to say, like, I first met her here. This is kind of where her interest and things changed. This is now what I see or what I find, sort of the most inspiring about her. That's worth nurturing. So don't underestimate, because a letter that just says that you got a good grade in the class actually can do more damage, especially coming from a Duke.
If I could break in, there's a question that was posted in the chat, and if the panelists could weigh in. Beyond GPA, GRE scores, and other academic qualifications, does any research in labs or other experiences at the undergraduate level help grad school competitiveness?
I would jump in and say that these days, pretty much in all areas of psychology, it's really important to have a good statistics background and perhaps some programming skills. Both of those are highly used and highly needed. And I think when you see an applicant who has more than just one statistics class, one psych statistics class, who has taken some quantitative courses, perhaps already says that they can program in some language, these are skills that are really valuable and really give you a leg up when you start graduate school. And I think many people, when they see that on an application, notice and make you a little bit different from a lot of other applicants. Maybe others have some suggestions as well.
Yeah, I was just going to say, doing something with your research experience, presenting at a national conference, even if it's a virtual conference in this weird time, but anything you can do to show that you've got that research experience and that you've taken advantage of all the opportunities that you have. This is another case where, following up on what Dr. Wilborn said, because you're at Duke and you have all these opportunities, people expect you to take advantage of them, as opposed to someone coming from a much smaller school may not have some of the same opportunities. So I think, getting that experience and showing that you have the skills is really crucial.
There's another question in the chat, and that is, if you are taking gap years, any tips or advice on staying in touch with faculty from Duke as your interests and work may evolve, especially faculty who you might want to ask for recommendations?
That's a really good idea. Stay in touch. You know, whether it's somebody who was your advisor or somebody that you had in class, it's not hard to do. And you know, people get motivated to follow your career when they know that. I mean, you know, that's one of the really rewarding things about being a professor is you get to see people's careers evolve and you get to play a role in that and see them go on and succeed. And, you know, writing a letter for somebody like that is a privilege, you know, when we get excited about it. So, but the first step is, you know, you want to win the lottery, you got to buy a ticket, right? You know, you want a good letter from the professor and you're going to be gone for a few years. Make sure you stay in touch. We're people, we understand. We went through this process. You know, our job is to pay it forward, but you know, definitely maintain that relationship. Absolutely. It's part of the sort of overall sense of diligence and building your career that everybody's been talking about.
Yeah, absolutely don't be afraid of writing and emailing faculty who you're cultivating for letters of recommendation. Most of us, and I will speak for myself, I love to hear what students are doing in their gap year. I love to hear how their career is progressing. I love to hear what they're thinking about after they graduate. I'm always sad when I don't know what happens to students who I, you know, felt close to in college. They graduate, they disappear. But I love hearing from students, and I think most of us feel the same way. So just keep in touch, drop an email and say, I was thinking about you, I saw this article and such, here's what I'm doing. You know, I just wanted to keep in touch. I really enjoyed working with you, or I enjoyed your class, or whatever it is that whatever reason that you think this person is someone who you feel might be great to write a letter for you. Keep in touch, we love it.
I actually have a question going off of that. So in terms of the people you're asking to write recommendation letters for you, should they be like Duke faculty, or could they be advisors or mentors that you have from elsewhere? And second of all, do they need to be within the psych and neuro department?
I think it's really important that you are strategic in who you pick as your letter writers. This is another mistake I think a lot of applicants make. In general, you want someone who can speak to definitely your intellectual skills, right? Writing, speaking, thinking, critical thinking, problem solving, and that's an important part that can't be missing. Then you want someone who can speak to maybe your growth, your change. If you've had some blemishes, if there's been some things that, like, someone like an academic advisor is also a good person. So I'm an academic advisor. I can't speak to sometimes my advisees' critical thinking skills or their writing because I haven't graded them, but I can talk about how they sort of decided their classes, their approaches, some of the things, their sort of problem solving. So you want someone who can speak to different aspects of you and paint a complete picture. So that's important. And in terms of with faculty, they have to make sense. So if you're applying to a certain place and you did a research project and you don't have that mentor as a letter writer, that's always like a red flag. Like, and so either you need to address it, or it's sort of viewed as like, I don't know, it's viewed lots of different ways. So think about, who would this person, what would they be able to actually write about me? Like, what experiences? Because what we fill out, you guys don't know this, but they give us this thing, you have to say, like, sometimes it's a Likert scale, but like most definitely, like, so oral skills, you know, written skills, you have to, and we have to rank, like, critical thinking skills. When we upload our letter, there's this little thing we fill out often. And I often have to say, like, not applicable. Like, I don't have any experience with, like, their ability to, you know, teach, for example. I don't know, I didn't see them do a presentation. So you want people who can check off different things on that scale, and also that can speak to you in a more well-rounded way. So be thoughtful and strategic about who you're asking, as opposed to just, I just need 3.
And I would follow up saying that, you know, if you do a gap year, you know, especially if it's like a prestigious NIH program or you're working in a lab, obviously those are people that could write for you as well. Personally, I would probably prefer letters from people who are somewhat related to my field. But if somebody had a great letter emphasizing your computational skills or something, that would be wonderful too. It's just less useful to me when someone is, you know, personally, employment letters are probably less useful unless they're describing skills that are specifically going to be of use in graduate school.
If I could break in with another question. A couple people who are attending are wondering about GWD and how it might help with application to programs.
I can jump in and say that, I mean, graduate programs are research programs, and the more research experience that you can get as an undergraduate and in gap years, the better. Because you're applying essentially for sort of a job. I mean, this is a lifelong process. You get a PhD, you're going to do research. You presumably are going to do some kind of research when you get your PhD. Presumably you're declaring that you're interested in doing research. And so the more experience that you have engaged in research activity, in a lab, in collecting data, in analyzing data, the better a candidate you will be for graduate school, because we are all looking for researchers. We're looking for people who have already decided that research is what they want to do. All right. I'm sure that Dr. Strawman would agree that if you're not interested in research, you shouldn't be applying to a clinical PhD program, but maybe a PsyD program. There is a Doctor of Psychology degree that is a non-research clinical degree. And that's a much better route to go if you're interested in clinical practice, but you're not interested in getting a degree that involves research. A PhD involves research. So I would say that if you have the opportunity to do a senior thesis, to do a graduation with distinction, yes, jump in, spend a year in a lab, write a thesis. It's a great thing to talk about in an interview. It's a wonderful opportunity to perhaps give a presentation, as Dr. Marsh indicated, maybe get a publication. These are really critical things in applying. I also, while I have the yellow box around me, I want to mention one other thing. For those of you who are in the process of applying or thinking of applying, I always want to point out to potential applicants that most graduate schools require this thing called a personal statement. And it's not the same kind of personal statement that you write for going to an undergraduate school. The personal statement, we don't care about your personal life. What we care about is your professional life. And so you need to write a personal statement that's about your interests in research, your background in research, your background in quantitative, and as Dr. Wilburn said, perhaps something about your growth, how you came to want to be a researcher, how you came to want to study the things that you say you're interested in, this kind of growth of who you are and what you want to do and why you're applying to graduate school. But we're really less interested in like what you did in elementary school, or that you broke your leg when you were a freshman in high school. These are things that we are no longer interested in. It's much better to think about your personal statement as a job application. And in a job application, you wouldn't be talking about family issues and personal problems and your elementary school life and things like that. You would be jumping in and talking about your skills and selling yourself as an applicant to this person, this school, this program. And it's really important to keep in mind that it is not the same as writing a creative personal statement for applying to Duke University. Don't do that. When we get applications like that, we giggle a lot because some of them are well written, very well written, but are kind of really off base for applying to graduate school.
I know our time is winding down, and there's a really difficult question posed in the chat right now, mentioning about how a lot of programs are suspending admissions this year or reducing the number of people they're admitting either this year or over the next few years, and what's Duke's approach to admissions over the next year and beyond, and whether there are any suggestions or whether it's advised to wait due to COVID to apply for at a later time.
So one thing to pay attention to is that some departments are going to be much more affected than others, right? So humanities departments are probably more likely to have to pull admissions. At Duke, we are collecting applications. We are currently moving forward as planned, as is UNC. I know the DGS at UNC. I would predict that there probably will be fewer slots than normal because funding may be tight, but partly it's going to depend on where people are getting their funding from. You know, for example, at UNC, it's going to be overwhelmingly funded by TA-ships, and those lines will still be there presumably next year. And so I would not pass up the opportunity to apply just because of COVID. I do think, and I'm curious to hear what my colleagues think, it probably will be, normally when the economy goes down, applications go up. And in this case, there probably will be fewer slots due to funding, but it doesn't mean if you're the best that you can't get in. I will also say quickly, because I see there's another question, that this is where if you go out and get your own funding, like the National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellowship Program deadline is this month, but you know, going somebody that has their own funding, it can make all the difference. Way back when I was an undergrad and I won an NSF GRFP, I immediately got off wait lists and admitted to schools. So that's just one other thing that you can do in this particular climate is a lot of applications do have a place where you can say whether or not you've applied for external funding. So it's a complicated question and a good question. But I would, if someone was sure they wanted to apply, I don't know that I would tell them not to, but it comes back to this issue again of writing those emails and asking if people are taking students.
One last question probably, and that is whether it makes a difference to earn a BS versus an AB for applying to graduate school.
No. But what does make a difference is what courses you've taken, right? And so it doesn't make any difference what your degree is or whether you have minors in 6 things. What matters is what courses you've taken. What matters is particularly what you've been taking in your last couple of years, because presumably in your last couple of years of college, you have some direction to what you're actually choosing to take. And if you are thinking about going to graduate school, presumably that's the time that you should be focused on taking the courses that would be the most valuable to you, either in choosing the kind of program you want to go to, the area, or doing some sampling or getting some skills that would be valuable.
Just to follow up on that, even in the clinical psychology realm, the thing that we are most looking for is, does this person know psychology? We can teach the clinical stuff, but if people show up and they literally don't know how to be a psychologist, they don't know research methods, they don't know statistics, they don't know the biology, they don't know the history of the discipline, and that's not somebody who's going to be an attractive candidate in any of these subfields. So, and whether it's a BA or a BS, doesn't matter. It's all about the coursework and the skills and the depth and breadth of your training in the discipline.
Well, our time for the faculty panel is up. Thank you so much for taking part, and thank you participants for asking questions of our faculty members. Thank you very much. And we're going to take about a minute and a half break as the grad panelists make their way here, and you all can go get a drink or stretch your legs a little bit, and then we'll come back. Thanks.
Thank you.
Is it time yet? I see several grad students have made their way in. So welcome back, everybody. We are now moving on to the second part of the info session, and this is with grad panelists representing lots of different training areas. And the hope is that whatever question you have, there will be a person or two here that can give a perspective on it. So if we could start first off by having each graduate student introduce themselves, say a little bit about in whose lab they work, what they do, or what their interests are, maybe something about even their path to graduate school, and then we can kind of move on from there. Just looking at my array, I'm just going to go with the first person I see, Wouter.
Hello, everyone. My name is Wouter Wolf. I am a fifth-year PhD student in Michael Tomasella's lab in the developmental area. And I work with young children and with great apes. So we're doing kind of the evolutionary development and ontogenetic development of social behavior. And in my case, in particular, creating social connections between people. And my path to grad school is, I guess, maybe a little bit different than that of others. So I came from a European system where I did 2 undergraduate degrees. Then I spent a year doing research at the University of Oxford. Then while I applied to work with Mike, who was in transition of moving to the US, I taught at the University, the Free University of Amsterdam. And then I ended up here in Durham.
Thanks. Paula, how about you going next?
Hi, I'm Paula Eust. I'm a 6th-year PhD student in the developmental area, and I work with Steve Asher and generally study peer relationships, specifically friendships, all the way from preschool up to college students. And my path to grad school, so right after undergrad, I worked as a lab manager in a research lab at Temple University for a couple years, and then came on to Duke after that.
Thanks. Savannah?
Hi, everyone. I am a 4th year in the clinical psych program. I work in Dr. Nancy Zucker's lab, and my primary research interests started out as early onset of eating disorders and have since shifted to peer relationships and peer support for broadly mental health. Between undergrad and grad school, I took 3 years off. I did a year as an RA in an undergrad institution, and then I worked at Mass General in a neuropsychological assessment clinic before coming here.
Thanks. Ava?
Hi, I'm Ava. I'm a 4th-year graduate student. I came in through the cognitive neuroscience program. I work with Marty Waldorf, Roberto Cabeza, and Tobias Eckner, and I study interactions between attention and memory. And yeah, in my undergrad, I worked in a lab for 2 years, and then I did a 2-year post-bac at Northwestern, and then came here for grad school.
Thanks. I have to accept my apologies. Do you say your name Nicholas or Nicolas?
Well, both, depending on where you are, I guess, but either one is fine. Thank you, Angie. Hi, everyone. I'm Nicholas. I am actually a 1st year in the clinical program. I work with Mike Gaffrey. So we work with preschool children mostly. And my research interests right now broadly lie in studying depression, particularly from an emotion regulation standpoint. and probing neural correlates or substrates of emotion regulation. My path to grad school is pretty winding. I actually started off as a biomedical engineer at Columbia University as an undergrad, transitioned over to psychology, worked a couple of like research assistant lab manager positions in New York, and then landed here with Mike. So happy to talk about that.
Thanks. Brenda.
Hi, everybody. Happy to be here. I am a fourth year PhD student in the social area. I work with Dr. Sarah Gaither. I actually see, I think one of our RAs is here. She didn't leave earlier. And I am really interested in racial identity, group identity, and how experiences of identity threat and discrimination can shape those identities in certain ways. And I particularly study multiracial groups and Latinx groups. Yeah. And I came to grad school actually directly from undergrad. I didn't take any time off. Yeah.
Thanks. Matt, you are next.
Cool. I am Matt Stanley. I am a fifth year graduate student. I came in through the cognitive neuroscience admitting program like AVA, and then ended up in the cognition and cogneuro area. I was a lab manager for 2 years for Roberto Cabeza, actually, before coming into the program. And since I've been in graduate school, I've totally shifted focus. I don't do any research in cognition or cognitive neuroscience anymore. I mostly do social psychology and organizational behavior. So if you want to talk about totally shifting gears in graduate school, we can do that.
Thanks. And Carol, I think you are last.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Carol. I'm a first year PhD student in the clinical psych department. I work with Dr. Tim Strawman, who was actually in the faculty panel just a little bit ago. My research interests lie in the differences between coping mechanisms with low-income kids and regular middle-class kids, kind of interested in seeing how there are differences in their coping strategies and, facing adversity there. I graduated from Johns Hopkins, where I kind of like bounced in some developmental labs and then finally landed in a more clinically focused lab. And after Hopkins, I was at Mass General for 2 years before coming here.
Thank you, panelists, for introducing yourselves. It's interesting, out of the 8 of you, 7 did something in between undergrad and grad. So, that just kind of highlights how important and desirable in some cases those kinds of gaps experiences can have. So where we go next is if anyone has a question right now that they would like to ask panelists at large, feel free to ask. And if we wait 5 or 10 seconds and nobody has asked anything, I'll ask something.
I was just wondering if there was anything that you guys wish you would have known during the application process that, like, being on the other side of things now, you realize that maybe you wish you could have done better, or maybe not. If there's any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I guess I'll pick that up as somebody who just finished that pretty much. And I guess Nicholas can also say something. The biggest advice that I have and that I wish somebody would have told me is take a deep breath. There's a lot about this process that's really subjective, and there's a lot of it that's about a faculty member identifying with who you are in your experiences and what you're interested in studying in, and less about having things done a particular way, and to kind of trust the process. I can tell you that I went on websites, I picked out my schools, I picked out the faculty that I was interested in working with. Highly recommend, emailing faculty, just saying that you're interested. But then also after that, trusting that the right faculty member is going to reach out to you for an interview. And that's going to be where the best fit for you is.
I can just add to that by saying that this was advice that I kind of got, but I before I applied, but then I really felt strongly about it after, of only applying to places that I felt like I would actually go. Grad school is not like undergrad where you should have backups, because grad school, there's no set timeline for this. So if you don't end up with a good match, it's a better choice to just wait a year and apply at other places, because the people who are taking students changes every single year, versus apply and go somewhere where you're not going to end up being happy, because it is a long time and you are committing to working with a particular person. So that is something that I had heard, but like maybe didn't fully as strongly, like I wanted to go to grad school in this particular year, but definitely it was a better choice to make sure it was a good match. And the other thing is more not about the application, but about at interviews, making sure that you talk not just with the advisor, but with the other students. That is where you get the best information, both just in general about the program, but also about what it's like to work with that particular advisor. Every mentee-mentor relationship is going to be different. So yours may be different from someone else working in that lab, but it can still give you useful information about how that person works and whether that's a good match for you.
And kind of to add on to that, I think, you know, with regards to if you do get an interview and you're getting there and you're just sitting there all nervous, just kind of, again, take a deep breath. But aside from that, also realize that the interview is not just you being judged by your supervisor, it's also about you judging the supervisor, because the match has to work both ways. So that kind of helps you perhaps kind of feel a little bit more, with a little bit more agency about, you know, the process and about the questions that you want to ask, because ultimately, you know, if you get judged very highly by your supervisor, but it turns out you're actually not a great fit, you're gonna, yeah, have to pay for that in the long term, probably.
Yeah, if on an interview you don't feel like they're trying to woo you to some degree, it might be something you want to consider in terms of that place's culture. Like if they're not wanting to say, you know, we think that this is an amazing place and we want to share it with you, versus you have to prove that you're worthy of this place. That's a very different tone and culture to a place.
And also in terms of the type of program that you're applying to, you can apply to work directly with professors, or you can apply into rotation programs. So I specifically only applied into rotation programs where I would work with multiple people and kind of see what was the best fit. I ended up working with all 3 people, so it was like I didn't do it the way you're supposed to do it, but it's nice to like to have that. If you feel like, oh, I don't know if during the interview process, if that's enough time for me to figure out if this lab is going to be a good fit for me. So thinking about what kind of dynamic in terms of the program is also going to work best for you.
And one other, I guess, separate piece of advice is that if you do decide that you want to work with specific people, it's usually not the best idea to just apply to them out of the blue without having contacted them before. Because first of all, you might be wasting your time if they're not taking grad students. But, you know, also just to get a feel of what we talked about earlier is like, is this really a place that I want to be? You even get a lot from, you know, what someone writes back to you in an initial email. And then when the applications do come, if you've contacted someone before, they'll most likely remember, or at least like look back at the email and be like, oh, this was this person. And that just gives you like a huge advantage over people who don't do that.
I was going to go ahead and move into a question that came through the chat, and that is directed at Matt. Could you speak a little bit about switching gears midway through and how you did it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that things that actually matter here and are important here are that it's not necessarily the case that by signing on to work with like a very particular person, you are fixed to that person for the next 5-6 years of your life. There can be some flexibility, and different programs are more flexible than others. So like Ava was saying, we both came in through a rotation program where you actually rotate through a few labs, sort of like test things out, see how things go. And then you sort of decide who you want to team up with in terms of the particular lab. And that was actually great for me. I understand that it's not necessarily for everybody, but it really helped me quite a bit. And then I'd say that, yeah, generally speaking, you're not like necessarily wedded to one particular person, one particular lab. There is some flexibility by and large. And a lot of it is just like what you seek out and what you're interested in. And so I've sought out people in the business school that I collaborate with a lot now. And that's perfectly okay. And none of my advisors have been upset by it by any means. They're very encouraging about it. So I'd say you're not fixed. The other thing that helps is funding. So I noticed that you all talked about NSF GRFP and NDSEG and some other options. Look into that. That gives you a lot of added flexibility and actually can make your life quite a bit easier. And so it's very much so worth applying if you can, regardless of whether you think you have fixed funding through your graduate school or your particular mentor for X number of years. It's worth at least trying. So look into that for sure.
Thanks. What other questions do people have for our panelists?
I guess I don't know like what I don't know. So what is like the best advice that you wish somebody would have told you when you were applying for grad school or in grad school?
I think for me, probably like early on, I wish I had said kind of no to more things in my like first couple of years, so that I could have spent more time just kind of focusing on learning the things that I didn't know and not like feeling like I'm just trying to just get the bare minimum knowledge to do what I need to do and then like move on to the next thing and move on to the next thing. So I wish I had taken things a little bit more slowly in the first couple of years. And I think it would have put me in a better position in the later part to like, okay, now I have like, I feel like I have a strong foundation now. And now I can be more productive. So I think that was probably like my biggest thing in the first couple of years. And eventually like my advisors did say to me, you have too many projects. So I had to drop projects. And so that happens, but I wish I had done that earlier.
So I can jump in because the question I see in the chat actually relates to the advice I was going to give in terms of like, there is a lot of different opinions about what work-life balance might look like in grad school. And you kind of have to figure out what actually makes sense for you, because this is your life for 6 years or 5 years or however many years. And unlike undergrad where you're living on campus, like most likely, and you're with your group of friends all the time, like you're having to live your life and cook dinners and do all the various other things. And so you kind of have to figure out how you want to structure your time. And people do it in very different ways, but you have to decide what works for you, and then be okay with other people using different techniques, and not, because you could feel like you should be working 24/7. And the reality is you can't. And someone else is going to have a different schedule. And if you're comparing yourself to what this other person is doing, it's not going to work out. And some of this is having a conversation with your advisor about what their expectations are and what your expectations are, so that you're on the same page as much as possible. It's not always possible, but you want to try. So I definitely benefited from having those 2 years where I was working in a research lab that had a very like strict schedule of like, I worked from 9 to 5, and then I had evenings and weekends free for like the first time in my life. I didn't know what to do with myself after undergrad. Like I took the GRE because I needed something to do in the evenings to study for this GRE. But by the time I got to grad school, I was very used to like having some of that time in the evenings or on the weekends. And so it helped me to prioritize that, to have had that shift. But I think that's something you have to figure out for each person. But just remembering that grad school is different from college in the way that you spend your time and things like that.
I'm gonna jump on that one too to piggyback. As someone who's in their first semester, who also had 4 years of working very, strict schedule, like 9 to 5, 9 to 6. I came in and actually came to Durham from New York with my girlfriend. So I had not only did I have the idea that I wanted to keep my work schedule to 9 to 5 Monday through Friday, but I also have her to spend time with and time that I want to be building our relationship and building a relationship with my cohort on weekends as much as we can, and really prioritizing those things. And I will say that in doing this in the last month and a half or 2 months that I've been here, even if you do have those sort of priorities, just because you have them doesn't mean that like it's going to be easy. I do think that when you do start to, limit the amount of time that you want to be working so that you're not working 24/7, you are going to see some things, fall through the cracks a little bit. And so you might not finish that entire, article the way you wanted to, but maybe you can wake up tomorrow 30 minutes earlier and, crank it out and just push something else back. And you kind of just have to remember to be flexible. And I think that that's definitely one thing that I'm learning, honestly. And I'm also taking advantage not only of working with my PI or my mentor, but also looking for other resources around Duke. And so here at Duke, there's something called grad school coaching, and you can look up Maria Wisdom, who is a wonderful resource for just, trying to navigate these sort of non-academic, non-like technical questions about being here and being a grad student. And I think tapping into those resources helps a lot.
Yeah, I found it very interesting coming from a European system that, the culture is a little bit different here. In general, Europeans are feel a little bit more entitled to have free time, to have free weekends, to have free evenings. And so that was to my advantage, where I can sometimes just, play that card. I think for me, the way, it helps, the way to think about this, I think that helps is to kind of see yourself in the same way that a professional athlete would. Like, they're not training 8 hours a day, 7 days a week, because they would drain themselves completely. And although there are things in grad school that are certainly, just quantity work, like grading, for example, is kind of mind-numbing, but, that's just something that you have to get through the pile. A lot of what we do is also very creative with regards to writing, with regards to, designing experiments and so on. And at a certain point, that doesn't work anymore if you overload yourself. And so you're actually just shooting yourself in the foot when you're trying to do too much. And sometimes, if you had a bad night of sleep, but you're trying to write for 6 hours, that's just not going to happen. And so you have to be okay with, realizing what state of mind you're in, and whether that is a good state of mind to do what you need to be doing. Sometimes switching tasks can help, but sometimes it just means taking some time off. Sometimes it also means going away for a week to really reset what you're doing, and even sometimes 2 days in a weekend is just not enough. So really think about it, even if that helps, from a more performance mentality of like, if I want to keep doing this, if want to run the 5-year marathon of being productive throughout that time, that means that I need to sometimes shift back a gear and relax, and then also plan that consistently in your week by still doing some hobbies like music, sports, or whatever. I think is quite important to also do.
We have another question in the chat, and that is how people made the decision to go for a PhD as opposed to other options.
As a clinical student, I did look into the possibility of going to a PsyD program. And I think that the decision for me was twofold. The first one was that like I really wanted to keep doing research. I know that I really like doing research, and that I kind of can't let that slide in my professional life. But also one fact that I can't deny influenced it is that I get a stipend to be here and I get my tuition waived versus having to pay for tuition plus living expenses at a PsyD program. That was something that was on my mind. I also decided to not pursue a master's degree. And I chose to do a postbac instead after undergrad. I do know some folks that decided to go get a master's and that they found that experience really enriching before starting a PhD. I think because of the clinical psych PhD, the fact that you get your master's kind of on the way, and the credits don't always transfer, again, because of financial issues kind of dissuaded me from going that route.
I'll maybe piggyback, or Brenda, you can go ahead.
I was just going to say generally, because I've had other people in my life who are thinking about graduate school ask me about pursuing just a PhD generally. And so I think some people don't realize that the PhD is a research program. So like Carol was just kind of talking about, like for clinical, you'll have clinical requirements as well, but especially for social and developmental and these other areas, the thing that we are doing is producing research rather than, maybe interacting more like hands-on with the community. So there are other like master's programs if that's something that you are more interested in. And that's not to say that we don't also get involved in things like that. But this degree program that we're in is mainly about research.
Yeah, and I would say, like, for me, it was really important to get research experience and see that I loved it, and that's how I made the decision. Because I think if you have that experience and you don't love it, don't go into a PhD program. You're going to be miserable. But I think like the best way to tell is to just join a lab and see if you enjoy doing the work. Because if you don't enjoy it, it's not worth it. But if you enjoy it, it's going to be great most of the time. Sometimes it still sucks, but most of the time it's good.
Yeah, I would also say that you really have to think about, what you think you want to do after, at least at this point. You never know for sure what you're going to end up wanting to do. But if there is a master's program that would let you do the thing that you want to do, then I would say, yes, the financial piece does come into it because PhD programs typically are funded. Don't go to a non-funded PhD program. That's not worth it. But if there is a master's program that would let you then go on to the career that you want, I would do that, because there's no reason to do this much longer program that basically just delays that career if you could already be doing it. So I think if you are wanting to really do research or you're wanting to teach at the college level, those are the two reasons that I would say a PhD makes sense. Otherwise, there are other paths to get wherever you want to be going.
I'm guessing one other consideration is how, obviously the rotation programs, but I also have talked to undergraduates who love research and they're in 5 labs at the same time, and I actually don't know which one of those directions they want to go in. And then sometimes actually master programs can help you focus your interests more, because a little bit of a downside of the liberal arts system in the US is that it's very broad, but you sometimes don't get enough exposure in depth to really decide on what you would actually want to do for 5 years, and a master's is really a good way of doing that. And if you're considering that, but there are financial considerations there as well. One thing you just might want to look into is master programs in Europe, but tend to be cheaper and at least equal quality. Some of the research masters there are really, really quite good. And I also, in general, have heard from faculty that, they find people who've been doing a master's, especially in a different country, to get a different feel for things. It really adds to the story that you can give in your personal statement, ways that have really had some international exposure to the stuff that's out there, and that's usually kind of will work for you in applications generally.
Also just say that I know that a lot of us did research assistant positions, and that's another great way if you don't want to go back to school right away and pay more tuition. Obviously, yes, there are a lot of benefits to doing a master's, and that can be an exploratory process in a way, but also finding a research assistantship can be a way to get paid and explore those interests as well. And just on the like, how did I decide to do a PhD was part of what Paula was talking about, just like that there are some different options that you can do after a PhD, and I didn't know which of those options that I wanted to pursue. And so having the PhD with a combined interest in research, but also thinking that maybe I want to be a professor someday, maybe I want to be a clinician someday, maybe I want to be a PI someday, or some combination of the three, that a PhD allows me to keep all those options open for as long as possible.
To be clear though, you don't need to know exactly what you want to do and exactly what you want to study at this point in your lives. You will probably change your minds to some extent. That's perfectly okay. You don't have to have everything figured out. And I'd say this, not everybody will necessarily agree with this, but I think that who your mentor is, who your PI is, matters far more than what you actually study in terms of like the narrow questions that you want to pursue. If you end up with somebody who is a really good person, really supportive, really good mentor, and will really help you reach whatever goals you want to reach, I think that is far more important than like, I don't know, trying to figure out some, or try to answer some narrow question about episodic memory or something like that. So don't stress if you don't know exactly what you want to do and you don't have your next 5 years planned out for you.
Yeah, I guess I should have clarified that a little bit more. I really meant like, you know, if you're not sure if you want to go into clinical or into developmental, you know, the general area, then it might help to. I never meant that you should have your 5 years of research essentially planned out, because that's only a small proportion of PhD students that come in with that level of you know, focus on the material.
I think I'm going to sort of piggyback and kind of loop back to another question, which was, you know, what do I wish I knew at the time of applying or maybe earlier? I actually struggled to know how narrow or how broad to keep my interests so that I wasn't, you know, too fixed on one thing when I was applying, but also not sounding like I was just interested in psychology when I was applying. And so I studied autism a little bit in undergrad and got really interested in language development. And then I went into my first RA-ship and then started getting really interested in schizophrenia and depression. And I was like, oh my gosh, how am I going to decide? And then it wasn't until that third year, that after undergrad, where I started to kind of think about all of it as one big connective thread, and started to find the things that really, really, really motivated me, and sort of the underlying thread that kind of brought everything together. And so when I remember, like at my interview with Mike Gaffrey, I said things that were hyper specific because I thought that was going to be impressive. You know, like I cited the paper and cited, you know, that one finding that was so important in that paper. But looking back at it, at that whole experience, I don't know if that really mattered. And I think that it was more about the bigger picture of this is maybe, you know, a set of questions that I want to answer, and this is kind of the approach that I'm coming with, rather than I want to study this exact mechanism, you know, and this exact brain region. And it's hard, and I think that the more you can talk to other people at your level, maybe grad students that you can, you know, access, and mentors that you have and professors that you have, to kind of navigate that balancing act, I think is really, really helpful.
Following up with kind of what Nicholas is saying, I would say that like the one thing that I wish I had known is like to be honest with both myself and the PIs that I was applying to work with about my research interests. Because I think that is where, like, you know, you'll hear this over and over again, like talking about like your mentorship fit and like fitting your interest fitting in with someone else's. And I found that like in the labs where like I tried to like, you know, spin off my interests into something that fit in with theirs, I didn't get interviews to those places. And it was really in the labs that I was like, oh no, like your vein of research, you know, like I have a specific question within your framework, but like we're really on the same page about what we're interested in terms of this field. That was something that I wish I had been told. Also, one thing that I didn't run into personally, but that friends of mine at Mass General ran into, is that sometimes your research questions might be answered by both like a clinical psych, within a clinical psych program framework, but also within like a strictly neuroscience program. And so then you kind of have to ask yourself, I think, particularly if you want to go into clinical, like you do have to think a little bit more about like what outcomes you want to keep open, what options you want to keep open at the end. I knew that for me, I didn't want to close the door of being a clinician someday potentially, but that like I wanted my focus to be research. But I had friends that didn't really care about being clinicians, and they turned down admissions to clinical psych programs to go into a neuroscience program that was like, you know, a really great fit for their research interest.
I want to add just that your research can also shift as Matt's did, or in subtle ways that, you know, it still fits that line that you came in thinking you want to do, but opportunities came up while you were in grad school. A new faculty member arrived and you started a collaboration with them. COVID happened and suddenly there are all these new questions that you can ask. And I think that that's even true once you were in another position after grad school. You're not stuck in one thing forever. So for sure, definitely don't feel like you have to decide on one and be certain for the rest of your life. I would say, unless if you aren't sure whether you want a PhD or not, then wait to go into a program. But otherwise, if you have some questions, it's more about curiosity and building those skills than the actual one question that you ask.
What other questions do people, oh, one just showed up in the chat. What are some of the plans for after grad school? Where are you all going to be situated?
I am navigating this right now. So I am applying for a bunch of grants, and I'm going to end up postdocing in the B school at Duke, actually, with Aaron Kay.
I am also doing this right now, and very uncertain about what I'm going to be doing. Ideally, the dream job one day down the road is to teach at a liberal arts college. I really found that I loved the teaching part of grad school, and it's not that I don't love research, but the parts of research that I love the most are actually working with undergrads and mentoring undergrads in research. But in this current climate, the academic job market is kind of a disaster. So I'm applying to a few things. I'm also looking into postdocs or various teaching positions and just kind of trying to explore my options while also kind of keeping open the door to going into a nonprofit that does child development research or any sort of thing. So there's many different paths that you can take. Academia is not the only one. And there are also a lot of non-traditional academic jobs that you can find yourself in. A lot of people that are in higher ed administration have PhDs in various different disciplines. So I would say there's maybe one traditional path, but there's not actually one common path these days. People do a lot of different things.
I'm like leaning away from academia, and as a fourth year, I'm like taking time now to kind of explore what different options might look like. Because what you hear about the most and the job that you know the most because you work with them is a professor. And so you know very much what you like and what you don't like about that job. And so it's easier to make a decision about that, but also hard because you don't know as much information about what the other options are. So I'm now taking more time to figure out, okay, what does day-to-day look like in this career path or this career path or this career path? And now which one can I actually see myself in?
As a first year, I have no idea, and nobody is pressuring me to decide. And in fact, like I'm getting encouraged to like, you know, explore different options and really keep it open and to just get some experience, figure out what I like in terms of research, in terms of like just what I enjoy doing and what I find innately interesting. And I hope that if you pick a grad school program you end up going, that it'll be in the similar way that they will encourage you to like not make a decision right away. And I was actually really honest about not knowing what kind of career path I wanted to take, and about wanting to keep my options open for the future when I was applying. And nobody had a problem with that. The one thing that, you know, I did make sure to state was that I loved research and I knew I wanted to stay in research somehow. And that hasn't changed. But in terms of like exactly where my money is going to come from in the future, you know, nobody cared.
Yeah, I'm also navigating this right now as a fifth year. I have the luxury that my supervisor can keep me on as a postdoc for a year, which gives me a lot of, well, some breathing room at least. But due to visa issues at a certain point, the US will make me leave. So I'm mostly applying for grants in Europe, finding people to work with, which is tricky during COVID, but you know, you just keep trying until you find something that you like.
If I could update us on questions coming in through chat. A question is, how sure were you about the research interests or questions that you proposed in your applications?
I'll jump on this one because I feel like I opened this can of worms. But I think I had 2 or 3 main topic of interest. So when I applied, I kind of set up, I actually took Paula's sort of advice and didn't apply to 35 programs. I applied to 10, and I spent a lot of time really crafting my statements for those because I really cared about them. And I felt like I would have trouble really choosing between those 10. And that was a good sign for me. And what I did was I kind of split it up into there's like 2 of my main interests. So I was either going to study the topic being social communication first or mood disorders first. And then I took a lens. And so for mood disorders, you know, depression and anxiety, and in both cases it was with kids. So that was an easy choice. And then I kind of took a lens. And so for mood disorders, I was like, I really have been thinking a lot about emotion regulation and how kids regulate their emotions in times where it might be difficult for them. And also going back to, you know, original interests in undergrad, like how do they use their language to do that, you know, and what kind of language do we use with children? And so that's kind of where I left that interest. And then when I was thinking about the schools and the PIs where maybe their focus was first social communication, I looked a little bit deeper and I noticed that they studied social communication, but also they studied, because I was applying to clinical programs, a clinical population, and their interest happened to be mood disorder. So it was a perfect kind of combination there. And so my lens there maybe was a little bit different. But I definitely didn't have a research question in mind. And I will say that gives me now the freedom to go to my mentor and say, I'm interested in 5 things. And I'm obviously not going to be able to pursue all of them all at the same time. But it's the exciting part about being in grad school. And so I think that sort of having an idea at least of the main topics that you really, really feel passionate about, that, you know, when that paper comes out and you get that email that, you know, this new study came out on whatever it is and you get excited, those are the things you want to start noticing, maybe the things that you're learning about in class as well. And then giving it a spin, you know, be again honest about what you're interested in, and kind of what Carol was saying, be true to yourself, and give it a lens that might be new and interesting. Another thing to note is just that investigators don't really want mini-me's. So don't feel like you have to be a photocopy of someone who is in a faculty position, because they don't really want someone to be doing their job. They want someone to add to what they're doing too.
To kind of piggyback on what Nicholas said, there were certain things that I was sure of. Like I was pretty certain that I wanted to work with children and adolescents, which was important. It's less important in a program here at Duke that has folks studying both children and adolescents and adults. But I interviewed at programs that were specifically like only child and adolescent focused. So if, you know, at some point I was like, oh, just kidding, I no longer want to look at kids and adolescents, that wasn't really an option because there were no other faculty there that were looking at adult, you know, psychopathology. So there are certain things that you do have to make sure you want to look at. And similarly, like there are some programs in clinical psych that only have an adult track. So If you know you want to study kids and you want to get that training, you know, you got to kind of capitalize on that, or diversify your application, like when you're applying the list of schools, so that they balance each other out, and know that when you commit, you might want to commit to a school that has both. And so I would say that, like, in terms, that was probably like how broad I had it. And I knew that I wanted to study like emotion regulation very broadly. How I went about that, I think I was less picky of. And I'm lucky that I ended up exactly where I wanted to be, I think, at the end of the day. But I think I would have been happy in other places looking at slightly different formulas of the same general topic of like coping in like different levels of socioeconomic status.
I was going to say that just briefly that I think that sometimes when we say like our research topics, or like we kind of have these like keywords that we throw out, and I think that's way more common. Or it could be like a keyword like you know, social interaction, or a specific area or specific psychopathology that you're interested in, or like, so a population of interests, or a like domain of interest, or it could be like a specific approach to studying. Like you could be really interested in the like mechanism behind fMRI and like really wanting to dive into that, but with a lot of different like people that you're throwing into that machine. So I think that it can be broad. It doesn't have to be super specific. And at the same time, if you have a super specific research question that you're really excited about, and you have kind of like a few questions off of that, then that's great too. But you definitely don't need to feel like you have to pick a specific, like, what if this question when you're applying. And I also want to echo that I've often felt pressured to like pigeonhole myself, like to be like, yes, I really align with this PI and exactly what they're doing, and very much on the other side, seeing how much it's appreciated to have just a passionate approach, but not to be a mini-me of the PI, I think was good advice that I got, and I'm happy to convey that again.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. You can actually even interpret it in two ways, right? You can be like, how sure are you what you want to do? And also, if you have a more specific research question as an undergrad, sometimes you have the question of, how sure am I that this makes sense? Because you might sometimes feel overwhelmed or feel like you don't know enough, which is a completely different problem. And I think for the latter problem, you know, I think PIs are fairly forgiving, that, you know, undergrads are not expected to know all the recent literature or that kind of stuff. They're taking them to develop, not to be, I mean, if you were postdocs, it's a different story, but PhDs are supposed to not know everything yet. And with regard to what people kind of already said about PIs not wanting a mini-me, I think what I've learned from, you know, I've worked with two people who are really kind of senior, you know, in their late 60s, and who did pretty well. And I think the one thing I really noticed with them is that what they were good at was, you know, valuing the input of their students, because there's no way what these two people did all came out of them. It's just impossible. It's not, that's just not how many ideas one person can have. So also when looking, you know, for a mentor, that is a very, very important quality to look for. There will be people, and it also depends on what you find comfortable. Like, you know, if you want someone who's more, has more of a very, has a kind of an agenda, or like a very set things, very set of things that they want to do, which, you know, you sometimes find with slightly more early career professors. That's great for some people because, you know, it gives them some structure and a sense of direction. And then sometimes you have people who are just like, you know, I'm just going to see what walks in the door, and if it interests me, and great, I'm completely willing to, you know, Mike before me had never done anything on social bonding ever. And he was happy to take me because the other part of what I was looking at interested him a lot. And so he was happy to kind of move further away from what he had been doing. So that's also, you know, part of what you get from the interview, seeing how willing someone is or how much someone is trying to, you know, shoehorn you in their line of research as opposed to giving you the questions about what you want to do. So that's another important thing to look out for.
Thanks for the thoughtful responses on that that one prompt. I got a lot of reactions from you, but I'd like to go ahead and there's a question that was directed to Brenda, and that is how you navigate studying specific populations. Since you are studying Latinx populations, and as a student as a Latina myself, I've always felt compelled to study about my community, but I'm discouraged and feel like it won't be taken serious.
Yeah, this is a great question. So thank you for asking it. There has been a stigma in psychology, and I'd say social sciences for a long time about quote unquote me search. So like researching something that is related to you or, you know, something that's important to you, like identity wise or something like that. And I would say I'm Latina as well, actually, which is, I find very helpful in studying the Latinx community. And I think being a member of that community provides me a lot of advantages to understanding these certain, like how this group functions in certain ways, like some of the experiences. Certainly, like I have a very singular experience and it's not the same because it's a very diverse set of people. But I do think having that membership myself helps me navigate my understanding of that, and then finding diverse collaborators as well in different ways. I would say one thing that really drew me to Dr. Gaither, who is my PI, was actually the fact that she really embraced the idea of me search. So she's a multiracial woman, and her lab, we focus a lot on multiracial identity. And that was probably the first time I ever saw somebody really like openly embrace what had previously been maybe described as like, you know, in a pejorative kind of way, that like, you know, you can study things that you are also directly affected by. I think I should note the concern about things like that is potential bias. Like if you're a member of those groups, you know, would you maybe have a bias? And my viewpoint is that we all have biases from our different cultural or whatever backgrounds we're coming from. And so being a good researcher is always about checking those biases. So just because you're a member of that group doesn't mean you can't be a good researcher as well of that group. Hopefully that answers your question.
That helps a lot. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Also, as a Latino student, or sorry, no, you can go ahead.
All I want to say is like, you know, this whole idea about me search. I mean, I've been interested and part of many social relationships and social connections across my life, yet no one faults me for, you know, researching that. So I think, but I do get where your question comes from. I do think that it's very important indeed to find a supervisor who not only supports that, but also has some experience doing that, because regardless of whether you're doing, you know, research in American subcultures or actual, you know, broader cross-cultural research where, you know, I know people who go to Africa, go to Papua New Guinea and those places, that just requires a completely different lens of looking at a problem. And if you don't have a supervisor who has that lens or has that experience, you're just not going to have the best training, even though they might be interested. So that's definitely one thing to consider. And for example, I know that Mike at a certain point turned a student away who came on recruitment weekend who wanted to do cross-cultural stuff because he just said, I'm not equipped to supervise this person, you know, which is maybe easier for him to say, you know, he has a lot of experience, he knows what he can and cannot do. But that's definitely something to look out for, I think, when you're looking for people to work with, is do they actually have that lens and that experience of doing that kind of cross-cultural stuff? Because it's just different in the same way that, you know, what we do with apes on a species level is completely different. And I should not, I would have been terrible if I would have gone to someone doing cross-species research with someone who's never worked with animals before. So, you know, that is definitely something to keep in mind.
Carol, did you have something to add to that?
Yeah, just very briefly, I'm also Latina, and I actually get like an opposite reaction. Like when I tell people that like I'm not exclusively interested in studying Latinx populations, like I almost get this like, why not? Like, why not give back to your community? Like I'm also an immigrant, and you know, I'm not exclusively wanting to do immigrant research, and people are almost like offended that I like don't want to use my personal you know, like experiences to shape research in this field. So I guess what I mean to say is that like people are going to have an opinion and an assumption about what you should be doing and shouldn't be doing, especially if you are from, you know, a minority group. So, you know, if you want to do it, go ahead and do it. Like, you know, answer the research questions you want to answer. And if you don't, that's okay too. Just again, like stay true to yourself and your research interests, because that's where your best work is going to come out of.
And I think one thing to, you know, realize if you're thinking about these things is like, you know, in science, we sometimes think of knowledge as just like a cumulative thing or just, you know, pieces of a puzzle that we have to put together. But it's really ultimately a conversation between people within a specific audience. And so in the question, you know, when it comes to being taken serious, when you're worrying about that, the question really might just be, have you, in that case, not found the right audience yet? Because there is an audience for this stuff. You just have to look for it. And then there are definitely people who are interested in this stuff and see value in it. But there will also be people who are not particularly interested in, who don't, you know, from their own interest see value in it. So it's really looking for those people is in that case, you know, important for you not to just find someone to work with, but also to feel some sort of value in what you're doing yourself. And once you do find those people, that is actually quite a relief and a very rewarding experience, I think.
Well, we are down to our last minute. I don't know if there's time for maybe one more question, if an attendee has something that they're really eager to ask. I guess that means that people have gotten a lot of information. It's been a couple hours that some people have been with us tonight. So panelists, thank you so much for being here for the last hour and fielding these questions and kind of paying forward. Really appreciate it. And attendees, those of you who are still here, thank you so much for being here and asking questions and exploring. And I will post this recording in the next day or two. And so anyone who's attending, tell folks that will be up and available and short order. But thanks and have a wonderful night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.